President Thomas Jefferson was elected to his second term in 1804, but his second term was not nearly as successful as his first term. Jefferson had to deal with the fact that the country had worsening relations with the country of Great Britain. And this worsening relations would eventually lead to the outbreak of war in 1812, a war known as the War of 1812. This war would break out in the presidency of his successor, James Madison. Just as the results of the election of 1800 are referred to as the Revolution of 1800, the War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second War of Independence, American independence, because in this war the United States confronted one of the most powerful nations in the world and held its own without faltering. Now, the United States did not technically win this war. They did not gain territory, they did not gain money, but they might not have won the war, but the war, since the war was a draw, essentially the United States really boosted up its national pride, and the Americans rallied around one another because by standing up to Great Britain, they had won themselves self-respect, but also won the respect of European powers. After this war, there was no longer any talk of Great Britain regaining control of its former colonies. In this lesson, we're going to do a number of things. We're going to examine the causes of the War of 1812, beginning with Jefferson's second term. We're going to examine the key turning points and events of this war, and then look at the war's outcome. Let's begin by talking about the road to war, how this war began. Now, one of the major causes of the war was the fact that the British were seizing American ships and cargoes on the open seas. And also, the British Navy was engaging in impressment. They were basically drafting American soldiers, American sailors, against their will into the British Navy on the grounds that they were deserters or that they were actually British subjects. Now, this problem with the British seizing American ships, this problem began in 1806. You see, in 1806, Napoleon in France, who was at war with Great Britain, he issued the Berlin Decree. And what he basically did is he closed all the ports of nations that were under French control or allied with France to any kind of trade with the British. Now, the purpose of this measure was that he hoped to basically ruin the British economy by denying the British trade with all these areas. And he hoped that this would put pressure on the British to come to terms with France and end the war between the two nations. Now, Great Britain responded to this blockade by France by issuing a counter-blockade. And in 1806, the British government issued what became known as the Orders in Council. Basically, what they said is that any ship that wanted to trade in Europe had to go to Great Britain and obtain a license from the British, and then they would be free to trade with whoever they wanted to trade with as long as they had that license from the British government. Now, this measure was designed to put on a counter-blockade to keep neutral nations from trading with France or its allies. Now, Napoleon, when he heard about Orders in Council, he responded in turn with what became known as the Milan Decree of 1807, which he said that any French ship that caught a neutral ship that had a British license, the French would seize that ship. So when it was all said and done, what American merchants found themselves in very much of an impossible situation by 1807. If they traded with the British or agreed with the British Orders in Council, they got attacked by the French. If they traded with the French or their allies, they got attacked by the British. I mean, it was a no-win situation for the Americans. So the problem was that Great Britain, the problem for Great Britain was that they were just much better at seizing ships than the French had. The French were. The British had a much more powerful navy than the French did. So over time, Americans came to be more hostile toward the British than the French because the British were actually seizing more American ships and impressing men into their service. So this created a lot of animosity between the Americans and the British. Now, in 1807, there was one particular incident that really infuriated Americans and made Americans very hostile toward Great Britain. It was an incident that occurred just off the coast of the United States, off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. An American ship, the Chesapeake, was sailing along, and it was stopped by a British naval vessel, the Leopard. And the Leopard seized the ship, and 4 men off of the Chesapeake were impressed. They were forcibly drafted into the British Navy on the grounds that they were deserters. Now, this incident really infuriated Americans, and there were calls for an immediate declaration of war against Great Britain. Now, Jefferson, like Adams before him, was a man of peace. So he hoped that he could put economic pressure on Great Britain and France to stop the seizing of ships. So he got Congress to pass the Embargo Act in 1807. And basically what the United States did was to stop exporting any goods from American ports. The Embargo Act shut off all trade between America and the outside world. Now, why did he do that? Well, Jefferson thought that if the French and the British were deprived of American goods, then they would stop seizing American ships. He was hoping that the British and the French demand for American foodstuffs, American naval stores like timber and cotton, that demand was so great that the British and the French would be forced to come to terms with the United States and stop seizing their ships. But unfortunately, that did not happen because neither France nor Great Britain did anything. They continued to seize American ships, both sides, and the Embargo Act ended up only hurting the American economy. One critic said that Jefferson had stopped the nosebleed by slitting the American's throat. But so the Embargo Act hurt the American economy, and it really hurt the popularity of the Republicans. In 1808, Thomas Jefferson, following the example of Washington, decided not to run for a 3rd term, and he endorsed his Secretary of State, James Madison, for the next president. Now, in the election of 1808, it was actually a much closer election than in 1804. James Madison was able to win a victory. He defeated the Federalist candidate, Charles Pinckney, and won the election, but it was a much closer election than had been the election of 1804. Now, in the next election, in 1809, now that James Madison was president, Congress agreed that the Embargo Act wasn't working. So they passed what became known as the Non-Intercourse Act. What this act did is it modified the Embargo Act and opened up American ports, but America could trade with anybody except France and Great Britain, because those are the 2 countries seizing American ships in the high seas. But the problem with this idea was that America's biggest customers happened to be Great Britain and France. So the Non-Intercourse Act was just as harmful in the American economy as the Embargo Act. So Congress worked with the President, and they passed in 1810 a new act called the Macon Act. Basically what the Macon Act did was to lift the embargo entirely for 1 year. And it would reinstate the embargo against the one nation that refused to stop seizing American ships. The intent of the measure was to try to give either Great Britain or France the incentive to stop seizing American ships, with the understanding that they were hurting their enemy. Now, Napoleon of France, he had nothing to lose, and so Napoleon of France, he approached the United States and said, "Sure, I'll stop seizing American ships." And now he was lying through his teeth, because French ships continued to seize American ships, but Napoleon at least made that promise. So under the terms of the Macon Act, President Madison went to, and he reimposed the embargo against Great Britain. So by 1811, all the focus of the hostility of the Americans was directed toward Great Britain, because they were the ones being seen as the aggressors, seizing American ships and impressing against their will American sailors into the British Navy. So that was a big problem. Now, that wasn't the only beef that the United States had against Great Britain. Another cause of this war was because Americans came to believe that as long as the British controlled Canada, they would continue to stir up the Indian tribes to attack American settlers from moving out west. So British Canada was seen as an obstacle to westward expansion. Now, in 1810 was a very important year because it was a congressional election, and what happened was that a whole new young generation of politicians was elected to high office for the first time. And a lot of them were elected from the West, from Tennessee, from Kentucky, and from the South. And these newly elected congressmen, these young guns, were known as war hawks. And they included people such as Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and Felix Grundy from Tennessee. Now, people like Henry Clay, they just idealized Thomas Jefferson, and he was their model. And they shared his vision of an America that was an empire of liberty, an America that stretched from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And from their point of view, what was the greatest obstacle to American expansion was Spanish Florida and British Canada, because in both cases, these foreign nations were encouraging Indian tribes, to attack American settlers by providing them with guns and supplies. Now, in 1810, it so happened that American settlers in what is today Louisiana and Alabama, along the Gulf Coast. This was the Spanish province of West Florida. Now, in 1810, a bunch of settlers had a convention in Baton Rouge, and what they did is they declared themselves to be independent of Spain, and they declared themselves to be the Republic of West Florida. And what they asked immediately was that they be annexed to the United States. And the war hawks, of course, were happy to oblige, and in 1811, the U.S. annexed this entire territory, and basically the entire Gulf Coast. And much of this territory was incorporated the next year in 1812 into the new state of Louisiana. So the war hawks were thinking, hey, look, we annexed Florida, or at least part of Florida, West Florida, maybe we can go ahead and take over Canada as well. Now, in 1811, there were certain events out west that convinced the war hawks that they had to do something about Canada. They had to, because as long as the British controlled Canada, they would continue to support Indian tribes operating out west. Now, in 1811, the Native Americans out west found one of their greatest leaders, a Shawnee chief by the name of Tecumseh. Now, he was a great diplomat, a great warrior, military strategist. He was able to put together a coalition of Indian tribes, of Indian nations, that stretched all the way from the Great Lakes all the way down as far south as Alabama. He had Creeks from Alabama, and Winnebagos from Minnesota, and Potawatomis from Wisconsin, all over. They all came in support of Tecumseh. Now, in 1811, the governor of the Indiana Territory was a man by the name of William Henry Harrison. And William Henry Harrison was seeing what was going on, and he was afraid. He was afraid of this rising coalition. So he decided to be proactive and go on the offense. So he marched on the town of Tippecanoe. Now, this was the sacred capital of this confederacy of Indian tribes. Now, at Tippecanoe, American forces won a great victory. They were able to defeat the Native Americans, and they burned Tippecanoe down to the ground. Now, it so happened that Tecumseh had been away at the time. He had been, unfortunately for the Indians, he had been away on a diplomatic mission down south. So when he heard about the battle and seeing that his confederation was in distress, he went up to Canada to seek refuge with the British government. Now, the fact that he had gone up to Canada, that was the proof of the pudding. That was proof that the British were behind all these Indian problems. And so the war hawks, when they heard about Tecumseh and his flight to Canada, they went to Congress and they demanded the immediate declaration of war. So in June of 1812, James Madison, listening to the war hawks, decided to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Great Britain, on the grounds that Great Britain was supporting Indian tribes that were attacking American settlers, and on the grounds that the British were seizing American ships and impressing American citizens. Now, the vote in Congress was pretty close, because almost all of the Federalist congressmen from New England, they voted against war. So America went into this war deeply divided, with New England against the war, but the South and the West really supportive of the war. Now, ironically, when this vote was taking place in June of 1812, across the Atlantic, the British Parliament actually voted to stop seizing American ships. So if Americans had known that, maybe there never would have been a war. Now, when this war began, in the War of 1812, not a very original name, but when this war began in 1812, the war hawks and many Americans who supported the war were confident that this war would happen very quickly. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said that conquering Canada was just a matter of marching. Now, they thought this even though the United States was really at a disadvantage. First of all, the United States did not have a well-trained large army. Remember, they had cut the size of the army back in 1801. Another factor was that they had to rely on state militias. Now, these volunteers from these states, they only agreed to serve for a very short term, and in some cases they refused to fight outside the borders of their own state. So there were a lot of limitations on these state militia on what they could do, and that created a problem for the United States throughout the duration of this war. Also, the United States really didn't have a whole lot of money or financial resources. The charter for the first bank of the United States, that charter ran out in 1811. And Republicans, they opposed the bank, so the bank was not given an extension. They refused to renew the charter. So basically, the United States government really didn't have any source of credit. They didn't have a way to borrow money. And no foreign government was going to loan them money to fight a war against the most powerful country in the world. Also, Republicans, remember, they hated taxes. So they weren't even willing to raise taxes to fight this war. So the government didn't have an army, didn't have much financial resources, and it was going to fight one of the greatest nations, most powerful nations in the world. Now, fortunately for the United States, Great Britain was not able to take full advantage of its superior size and forces, because for most of the war, Great Britain had to direct most of its forces to fighting the war against Napoleon in Europe. So most of the British forces were in Europe until 1814. And for most of the war, Great Britain had to rely on very poorly trained Canadian militia or Native American forces to supplement their regular army. So that kind of equaled things out between the two sides. Now, in 1812 and 1813, the war did not go at all as anticipated by the war hawks. There was a lot of disappointment. First of all, when the United States tried to invade Canada, using largely New York as its base, the New York state militia, most of them refused to fight outside the borders of their state. So basically, they went into this invasion mode with a force that was very much diminished. In fact, things went so badly that by the end of 1813, the British had occupied almost every major fort along the Great Lakes, forts such as Fort Detroit and Fort Niagara. These important forts were all in British hands. Now, the United States did have some victories, though. For example, they won the great battle, the naval battle of Lake Erie in 1813. The commander of U.S. naval forces was Oliver Hazard Perry, and they were able to defeat the British on Lake Erie. And this was a very important victory because it secured control of the shores of Lake Erie for U.S. forces. Now, it was also in that year, in 1813, that U.S. forces marched into Canada in what was called Upper Canada, what is today the province of Ontario. And the U.S. forces were under the command of William Henry Harrison. Now, they met the British at the Battle of the Thames. And in this battle, they defeated the British, but more importantly for the Americans, they defeated the Indians. The Indians were fighting alongside the British in great numbers, and in the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh, one of the great Native Americans in history, he died in battle. And that was a great blow to the Indian cause. So that was a great victory for the United States. It was also in 1813 that another expedition of Americans marched into Canada in a raid, and they burned down the city of York. Now, the York is today the city of Toronto, and it happened to be the capital of Upper Canada. So there were some victories to offset the setbacks that Now, these military setbacks that occurred in 1812, 1813, they gave a temporary resurgence to the Federalist Party. In 1812, James Madison, at the end of 1812, November, he ran for re-election, and the Federalist candidate was a man by the name of DeWitt Clinton. Now, it was a much closer election. DeWitt Clinton lost, and James Madison won, but it was a lot closer victory than had been the victory back in 1808. So the war was kind of taking a toll on the popularity of the Republican Party. Now, in 1814, there was a big turning point in the war. You see, what happened was that the war in Europe came to an end. Great Britain and its allies, they won a great victory over Napoleon. He went into exile, and the war ended in Europe. So now Great Britain could devote all of its resources to fighting against the United States. It could focus all of its full attention on defeating the United States. Now, the British government thought that they could reasonably acquire lots of territory and from this war. So they had what was basically a three-pronged attack in 1814. One prong was that a British army was going to march south from Montreal in Canada, and they were going to march into the Hudson River Valley and dominate and control this very strategic river valley. That was prong one. Prong two was that British naval forces were going to mount a blockade on the entire east coast, of the Atlantic coast, and occupy key ports along the coast. Finally, the third prong was that a British force was going to go into the Gulf of Mexico and take control of the port of New Orleans. Control of New Orleans meant that they would control the entire lower Mississippi River and the mouth of the Mississippi River. Now, fortunately for the United States, the British plan did not happen, and the Americans won some victories. In the first prong on Lake Champlain, as the British were trying to invade the Hudson River Valley, in the Lake Champlain, on that great lake, American naval forces under the command of Thomas Macdonough, they won a great victory over the British Navy. Now, with this victory, the Americans secured control of Lake Champlain. And see, with American control of the Lake Champlain, the British weren't able to mount their invasion of New York. So after they lost this naval battle, they withdrew their forces back to Canada. So there the British won, the British lost, and the Americans won. Now, along the Atlantic coast, British forces actually marched on Washington, D.C., and the Americans were forced to withdraw, and the British forces actually burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. The British said that they were burning Washington, D.C. to avenge the earlier burning of York up in Canada by American forces. So that was a big blow to the Americans. You know, President Madison barely got out of there before the British arrived. Now, it wasn't all fun for the British, because the British were trying to capture the port of Baltimore in Maryland. And the port of Baltimore was protected by a fort, Fort McHenry. Now, the Fort McHenry was protected by the Maryland Volunteers. Now, the British tried to bomb Fort McHenry, but McHenry stood and did not surrender. And the bombing of the Fort McHenry was the inspiration for Francis Scott Key, who was observing the bombing, for the American national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. You know, bombs bursting in air and all that. That was the bombing of Fort McHenry in 1814. Now, by the end of 1814, the British realized that war was not going as they had planned. Now, Arthur Wellesley was better known to history as the Duke of Wellington. He was one of the elder statesmen, the great general, the one who defeated Napoleon. And he advised the British government at this point just to reach some kind of negotiated settlement. You know, the war was unpopular, the war was expensive, just have a negotiated settlement. And even Americans, Republicans and war hawks, former war hawks, were thinking, hey, maybe this war did not go as planned, maybe we need a negotiated settlement. So in December, after some months, in December of 1814, the American diplomats John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and Henry Clay, the former war hawk, they got together with their British counterparts at the city of Ghent in what is today Belgium. And the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent in December of 1814. Now, basically, this Treaty of Ghent showed that the war was a draw. Basically, the British agreed to withdraw from all the forts along the Great Lakes like Detroit and Niagara, that they had occupied during the war. And in return, the United States agreed that they would not seek any compensation for all the American ships and cargoes that had been seized over the years by the British Navy. So it was a draw, and the two sides agreed to this settlement. They also, this is very important also, they agreed that if they had future disagreements over the border between British Canada and the United States, that they would set up joint commissions to negotiate the border between the United States and British Canada. Now the war, up until the end of 1814, had been a tremendous disappointment to the Republicans. And the Federalists, who were their base of power in New England, what they saw here was an opportunity to take advantage of this situation and to benefit from it politically. So in the fall of 1814, delegates from all over New England, they met in Hartford, Connecticut. It's called the Hartford Convention. And now some of the delegates were so against the war that some delegates were saying, hey, let's secede from the United States and create an independent United States of New England. But the majority of the delegates at this convention decided that it would be better to propose a series of constitutional amendments that would strengthen New England at the expense of the South and the West. Remember, the South and the West, they were the strongholds of the opposing Republican Party. Like one of the measures they proposed would be to make it a new amendment to the Constitution that would require 2/3 of the existing states to approve a new state from joining the Union. That was to make it harder for new states out west to join the Union. Another new amendment to the Constitution was that they no longer wanted to count slaves when they did the census. Remember, the census determined the number of delegates, the number of representatives sent to each state to the House of Representatives. So the idea, by eliminating slaves in the census, that would lower the representation of southern states in the House of Representatives. So they hoped that these amendments would actually strengthen New England at the expense of the rest of the country that supported the Republicans. Now these plans all collapsed, and the Federalist cause collapsed. It was all due to Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans, which was fought after the war ended. It was fought in January of 1815. You see, the British forces attacking New Orleans, they didn't know that the war was over, and neither did the American forces under the command of Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson had put together a pretty motley crew. He had mainly Tennessee volunteers, hence the name of the University of Tennessee. He had a bunch of Tennessee volunteers. He had Choctaw Indians from Mississippi, and he even got some French-speaking pirates from the Gulf Coast, and who provided cannon. And with this motley crew of volunteers, he went out and he defeated one of the most elite and experienced armies that the British had. And it wasn't just a defeat, it was a landslide. I mean, it was a crushing defeat. In the Battle of New Orleans, the British lost 2,000 men, whereas on the American side, they lost 70. So this was a big, huge victory, and the British had to get back on their ships and crawl home. Now, what happened is, across the country, is that most Americans heard about the Battle of New Orleans before they heard of the Treaty of Ghent, because of the problems of communication back then. So as a result, a lot of Americans said, hey, we defeated the British, and the British sued for peace. So even though the war was technically a draw, a lot of Americans across the country thought, hey, we won the war. We got the last word. We defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. You know, for a lot of years, the Battle of New Orleans was a national holiday in many parts of the country. Now, it made Andrew Jackson into a national hero. Now, it was this victory that the United States had that was the death sentence for the Federalist Party. I mean, because they looked like they were petty, they looked like they were partisan, they looked like a bunch of unpatriotic people who were trying to score points at a time when America was at war. And so after this victory at New Orleans, the Federalist Party just collapsed upon itself. And the Republican Party became by far the dominant party. So real quickly here, what I wanted to do next is talk about some of the important outcomes of the War of 1812. One of the things that happened as a result of this war was that there was a surge of nationalism. Americans took pride and that they had stood up and fought, and in their view won a war against the most powerful country in the world, Great Britain. Also, another outcome of this war was that this war destroyed the Federalist Party. You know, their decline had begun with the Revolution of 1800, and then this was the final blow. And so with that, the idea of the Federalists, this idea that you needed to have a conservative, aristocratic, people of wealth and social status to run things, that idea just went out the window. That idea never was revived. That idea died along with the Federalist Party. And finally, the war, well, not finally, but another aspect of the war was that it defeated the Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River. Resistance to American expansion almost collapsed following the death of Tecumseh and the collapse of his coalition that he had been put together. You know, the Battle of the Thames was a decisive blow to the Native American cause. Also in 1813, Andrew Jackson, before he won the Battle of New Orleans, he marched into Alabama and met the Creeks in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. And the Creek nation was crushed in this battle. Now, after the war, with the defeat of the Indians, Americans just rushed out west to settle in these areas. Now that no longer the Indians were the threat, people were moving out there like crazy. And after the war, a bunch of new states were added to the Union. Indiana joined the Union in 1816, Mississippi joined the Union in 1817, Illinois in 1818, and Alabama in 1819. Like boom, boom, boom. New states were added to the Union as more and more people moved out west now that the Indian threat was no longer present. Also, another thing was that the war boosted American manufacturing. Remember, the embargo of 1807 and the War of 1812 had the effect of banning basically British manufactured goods from American economy. So Americans started to build their own factories and produce goods instead of purchasing them as imports from Great Britain. Between 1807 and 1810, the number of textile factories, textile mills, jumped from 15 to 87. That's a pretty big increase. The year following the War of 1812 were a period of economic expansion and territorial expansion, and we're going to be looking at this expansion, this era of good feelings, in our next lesson.